what I want to explore with you is how do we sustain, if we believe, and all of you said to us in the research, and everywhere I read, it says sharing leadership is a good thing. The problem I have with statements like that is, well, it may be a good thing, but is it sustainable? And what will help sustain it? So if we embark down the road of, let's say, a shared leadership model, or indeed distributed leadership, call it by any other name you wish, how do we know we'll be able to sustain it? Because how will it survive people moving in and out? In a school, a principal comes. A principal is passionate about distributed leadership or sharing leadership, engages the gifts of the other all the time, and then somebody new comes in. We want the models to actually survive and sustain themselves beyond dependence on individuals. So this is work that we've been undertaking to take our concepts of collective leadership and provide them with a framework and a core. So my argument in recent times has been you will not be able to sustain the sharing at a high enough level unless you have some core moral purpose, core values, core ethics supporting it. Sustainability comes from our core values, our deep belief that it's not just that shared leadership is a good thing, it's that it's only through sharing leadership that we can give the best possible deal to our parents and our students. Now, in new work that I'm doing, I have a long argument around all of this, but in the time available, I'll just share a few ideas with you. And the core ones really are, one, coming from our belief system, our own beliefs as Catholics. A core value in why we must share. It's an imperative that we must share because we say we respect the gift of the other who's made in God's image and likeness. And many more such deep concepts coming out of our faith, like communio, the concept of communio, of working together. A few years ago, I built a whole framework just out of Scripture and Vatican documents to support the concept of shared leadership. It wouldn't take you very long to do that yourselves because you probably know the Scriptures and the documents better than I do either. So what I've always argued is, coming from what we believe in our own faith, we have imperatives in there as to why we should share. That's one. A second reason is that as professionals, we have a vocation. When I first became a teacher, I honestly felt I had a vocation in life. I had a calling. What was that calling to? It was to the lives of the young people in my care as a teacher, in our care as teachers. Just think about it. Parents hand their precious little ones to you, and you are expected to transform them. That's your job. Not just alone in terms of test scores, however important they may be at particular points in time, but as people. As you want to send them out into the world as well-rounded, mature, believing adults, young adults. So it's a calling. Indeed, it's an ethical responsibility, and as Jerry Stard would remind us, we must work together for the common good of the children. And if we don't do it, he would argue, we're behaving unethically. Not many people say that about the imperative to work together. So for example, a teacher who goes into the classroom, closes the door, and says, well, I'm a professional, I know what I'm doing, and what I'm doing is nobody else's business, I'm sorry. It doesn't work like that in a collegial profession. It is everybody's business. What's happened in that classroom is everybody's business in the school, all within your spheres of influence. And you can't ignore it. It's not good enough for a teacher to see bad behavior going on and say, well, I'm not on duty today. that sort of attitude, or the isolationist attitude which some teachers have. Thankfully, hopefully, not that many anymore, but it's still around, alive and well. So, being ethically responsible constitutes a personal virtue or a morally valuable trait. If I'm going to be ethically responsible for the children in my care, I have an obligation to work with my colleagues. As a principal, Dan said it brilliantly earlier on, is you search out the gifts. Know the gifts that you have on your staff, and then, as the Jesuits have done forever and a day, use them. There's a great deal in terms of leadership I'm talking now. There's an enormous amount of wastage in our organizations, in our schools. Great talented people. Know them and use their talents. Otherwise, you are a waster as well. You're a waster of talents. So, teaching is a collective responsibility, and I believe every school, I argue strongly, should not alone just have a vision or a mission statement, but a statement of moral purpose. Now, moral purpose is sort of the mantra that we can all say together, and we can say it very often, and it will always have to do with our students. Students will be at the heart of it. For example, when you go to Ontario, everybody talks about raising the bar and closing the gap. That's Michael Fullen. He has a big influence on the system over there. They reduce it down to what might appear to be a pithy saying, but it's a powerful statement. So if I asked you, what is the moral purpose for you going to work every day? What is it that makes you passionate about what you do? Could you distill it down to its very essence? A few words. As we were reminded from the outset today, this is a journey we're on. We're all on the journey. We're all learning together, and we're all moving, as Helen would put it, towards wisdom in leadership. Let me show you some questions that I think would be really great questions to get some courageous conversations around in your schools. If you believe in shared leadership, or I prefer to call it collective leadership, because I believe in a collective ethic of responsibility for leadership, and we have to elevate it up. Once we elevate it to the level of an ethic, people have to take it much more seriously. And that ethic, of course, is built around our students and the very thing that you were writing down there or talking to your friends about, the moral purpose. What is the moral purpose that we have in our school that keeps us passionate about what we do and keeps us going on, even though the challenges sometimes are great? But after all, in the end of the day, it's not the end of the world. They're only challenges. The good thing about challenges are, you know, mostly we can resolve those kinds of issues. That's where wisdom comes in. That's where your experience as a leader comes in. I don't want to say principal there, I want to say as a leader. So I'm not going to go into these questions now, but they would, you know, 10 minutes at a staff meeting, 15 minutes at a staff meeting over a period of time discussing this, and see then what the points of view are. It's just like a pedagogical discussion in many ways. You will be surprised when you open up the discussion how many different points of view there are. And you were saying that, Helen, as well. Don't forget, for those of you who are a believer in John Hattie, that John Hattie says the differences within schools are greater than the differences across schools in this country. That means there must be quite a variety internally. And as a principal, I would want to know that. I would want to know, where are people coming from? What are the assumptions they have about pedagogy? What do they believe about teaching and quality teaching? What do they believe about learning and teaching, learning, that connection? What do they believe about what must be in place in the learning environment to inspire our young students? But above all, what do they believe about the relationship that a teacher should have with his or her students? Because we now know for sure that the quality of that relationship has a massive influence on the quality of learning and the quality of student outcomes. So I've been, for some time now, pursuing this concept of how does it work, this collective ethic of responsibility, this collective notion of leadership. And one of the questions you have to ask is, how much influence can I have within my sphere of influence, or influence field as I call it, on what really matters in schools? Now, I'm going to speak more of the learning side for a moment, but Dan has really focused you on the spiritual, the ethical, the moral earlier on. I'm a very big believer in that, but what I'm actually trying to do is put the two together. It's not an either-or world, it's a both-and world. And we can do both and do both very well. And we can infuse our pedagogies and our relationships with moral purpose, ethics, spirituality. You know that, you do it all the time. So there's no great mystery there about bringing those two together. We're very good at it within Catholic schools. One of the things that I've been studying is how do you maximize your influence, or how do you strengthen, is the word, your influence on what happens in the classrooms or in the learning spaces, and ultimately in terms of performance of teachers and students. Now, much of the research that informs that discussion at the moment is effect size research that Dan made a reference to this morning, earlier on. Effect size research, and many of you will know about it here, is a linear measure of influence, usually a figure between 0 and 1. And the lower the number, the weaker the influence. So many of you might be familiar with John Hattie's work more than, let's say, Vivian Robinson, although you would know both. But John Hattie will say, okay, if you provide two-way feedback, so the feedback one, which has a high effect size score, over here, then through his linear regression analysis and meta-analysis of other studies, this is the effect size it has here. I forget the number, but it's somewhere close to 1. It's high. It's big impact stuff. That's another day. I have problems with effect size research. It has huge limitations, and it's methodologically not sound. But I'll just show you why, or talk about why in a moment. Take Vivian Robinson's work. She has done a meta-analysis of all the research ever done on leaders influencing student achievement. And that's John Hattie's work as well, student achievement, right? Effect size. Trying to establish, let's say, for principals, because out of our 27 studies, 18 or 19, I forget the number, were principals. Some assistant principals and deputy principals, and then more recently a few leadership teams. But it's not that many studies, is it? All ever done that passes her test, which is fairly stringent in terms of the methodology. So we have to assume these are solid tests in terms of the way they were done, the methodology. If you look at the list of things that, as principals, you can do to influence student achievement, basically after 1, which is participating with teachers in the professional learning, which has an effect size score of 0.82. The next one, which is setting clear goals and expectations and supportive learning, drops down to 0.42, which is kind of should I not bother territory. Maybe I'm better off at home, I might have more influence sort of stuff. When I looked at these results, I immediately thought, something seriously wrong here. If I were a principal and are reading these results, I would seriously get depressed. I would think, what's going on here that I can only have this narrow range of influence? And the reason for it is it's regression type scores, it's linear, and it's measuring that relationship between one thing you do here and something over here. I've got news for you. That's not the way influence works. Then you're told you're second only to classroom teachers and that. I'm competitive. I don't want to be second. Secondly, most influence, the way it occurs in our lives, is not linear, really. It's nonlinear. So I want to explore with you some new, and the good news is, how can I influence student outcomes? I say to you, let me count the ways. Hundreds and hundreds of ways, but it doesn't show up in just linear forms of research. That's why it looks depressing, especially if you're in a leadership position. Let's look at some new research. In a new book I've just published a couple of weeks ago, the whole argument is in there, but I've also come across at the beginning of this year, in January, some very exciting research out of the University of Southern California. And It's looking at influence and the nature of influence and how it occurs. And as principals, you need to know this, because there are so many ways and so many strategies you can develop, deliberate strategies to strengthen is the word. I don't believe, by the way, there is such a thing as indirect influence. You either have it or you don't. It's either strong or it's not as strong as it could be, often called weak. But we don't like that kind of language here, isn't that right? We keep away. I've undertaken a course in positive psychology, so I'm very positive nowadays. That's why I won't get depressed on any of this stuff, because it's good news. But let me share with you some work. Levine and Datner are two researchers at the University of Southern California. They decided to try to map how influencing actually occurs in districts over there, systems we'll call them here, of schools. How does it work? And who has influence? Oh, I didn't mention, you know, if the principal should go home and get depressed, what about the people in the office? They don't exist at all according to linear research. You know, they have no influence. They might as well be working for Macquarie Bank and make a lot more money. But this is serious stuff that we're going to talk about now. They researched what they called multi-actor models of how decisions are made around data. Evidence-based improvement, right? They called it data-driven decision-making, DDDE there. And so they looked across the country in the United States, and through recommendations, 75 schools were recommended as real high flyers in using data to bring about improvement in pedagogy and in student outcomes. So they went in, and then from that they selected the top 12. So they went in and spent quite a lot of time with teams in these schools trying to determine, how does it work? How does influence occur? And which way is the influence? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? Well, you'll see in a moment, it's every which way but loose. Is that the movie? They were interested particularly, why did that do that? Well, they were interested in principal's role. I don't know how that's flipping forward like that. They were really interested to see what role does the principal play in all of this. And they mapped it. And their models are available, and I've given you the reference to it. You can download these models for yourself, and you can have a play with them. You can be the director, the executive director, and say, well, if I tweak this, what's going to happen down the line? You can be a student in the classroom. What if I get more interested and I have more ownership of my learning? There's a spiraling effect of influence from students in the classrooms. This is the model. It looks busy, but it's simple, really. Okay, district. Don't forget district over here on the left. I do have a pointer somewhere here. District is really the system level people. The principal's actions, the teacher's actions, and the student's actions. And the good news is that when we work together, in the terms of positive psychology, we amplify each other's influence. We raise each other up to higher levels of motivation, of morality, I believe, too, as well, because now we're the collective ethic of responsibility, and the good news is performance. I'm reading research on authentic leadership at the moment, and on virtuous organizations, and on mission-inspired organizations, and all of the research is saying, you go this direction, you work together, everything changes. Your school cultures will raise themselves up, it's the people in it, and it has very positive impact on teacher performance and student performance, even on tests. It's really, really good news. Now, the explanation is that the larger the circle, the more intense the activity in that particular area. The darker, and it's not showing up that well, when you download these yourselves, the darker the circle, the more activity, the more intense the activity in that area. So the size of the circle is the amount of activities and the getting together, the multi-agent mediation, which is influence, that occurs. And they're showing this is data-driven decision-making to improve learning. And they're mapping it, and all of these have an effect on one another, an influence on one another. They even say we're trying to capture the non-linearity of decision making and of the things leaders do. And I'm really inspired with this research. And all the other research from positive psychology about authentic leadership. You know, I've been talking about that for 20 years now. But now there's quite a lot of research coming out on authentic leadership tying it to student outcomes. Because we have to have that evidence. It's demanded of us. It's no good talking about authentic leadership being a nice, touchy-feely, we're one big happy family around here, but we don't get anything done really in terms of performance. No, now it's been tied quite clearly, and this is research that's leadership science research, learning science research, which is quite different from effect size research and the traditional empirical research. So that you can go home and download it, and I'll leave this one up for a few moments. That's the contact, the URL, and you can actually download these models. There's another one of the principal together with the teachers and how they interact and what happens up at system level. Look, you're useful after all. You have influence. And now it's been mapped. To my knowledge, not before. I haven't seen anything like this before. It's very reassuring, and it's telling me you have so many ways that you can influence. In work I've done in New Zealand and some dioceses here in this country, and in Ontario particularly, I've tried to map out what is in your field of influence. What makes up your field of influence? Leaders. I'm particularly interested in leaders. And it's amazing when you trawl through the research and talk, and I would sit down with you and say, and you share this with your colleagues, how do you deliberately set out to influence what happens in classrooms? How do you do it? Talk to one another. You'll grow your wisdom, you'll grow your repertoire of strategies very, very quickly. Share. That's why collective responsibility for leadership is an ethic. We owe it to our students. We also, I'm so excited about the fact that student actions have ripple effects right up through the organization, especially if they're awake at the top, which most good systems are. They're constantly trying to, let me, a small aside. I've been doing research around, if we want these learning environments, these new, exciting, rich learning environments, what is preventing us from doing it? And I probably have done that with some of you sitting in this room. I use interactive keypad technology to get your responses. Do you know the number one that has come out from roughly 1,500 principals in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Ontario in Canada? What would it be? What is the biggest obstacle to achieving this? And I don't want to be teacher bashing today. I didn't say it. It was the attitude of teachers, the isolationist attitude, or the concept that I'm an individual that I said earlier on. I know my profession. It's nobody else's business. That comes up in the top 2 or 3 constantly. And there are others. But you know what another one is? The learning styles and needs of students being mostly ignored. And that's another word I didn't want to use. That's the word that came back to me, ignored. I thought maybe not understood properly or not responded to or something. No, ignored. Now down here, they're not being ignored, and look at the ripple effect that they have up through the system. So download that, play around with the model. Dan, you can take the top one there, make that circle bigger and see what happens through their data down the system. Yeah, but you can see, I said about strong and not so strong. That's an area then you'd look at and say, ooh, we better do better, we must do better there, and we'll strengthen that. And when we do, it has a ripple effect. How do we build leadership capacity? Well, in the book, we talk about the fact that we've skirted around the edges in many ways. We've talked about what are the, if you read Hargreaves and Fink's book on sustainable leadership, there's a lot of wisdom in there. So we've been fiddling with that. We've always, coaching and mentoring are really good in themselves. Distributed leadership is one that's often, we think we're doing the right thing, and often we do it well, and sometimes we don't do it so well. And succession planning has been a big one over the years. But it's no good in focusing on any one area like this. It's not going to bring us sustainable collective leadership. And I'm convinced, like never before, the only way you can get it is to have it in the heart and the soul, to believe deeply that this is a thing we must do. That's the collective ethic of responsibility. And I would remind teachers of that all the time, constantly, why we're here. And that's why your moral purpose, where it comes in. You keep, and you know the ones that Dan was saying earlier on, you know, they're always complaining about this or they don't want to go to that. I would give them so much moral purpose, they'd want me to shut up. So that, you know, or the ones who stick their heads around your door and say, I'm sorry to interrupt, I know you're busy, but, these are the but people. Well, what I would do there, and I have practiced it even at the university level, is I'll give them moral purpose every time. And always when they come, so after a while they stop coming. But you hope you have some effect. So what we're saying is here, look, none of these on their own, but you include them in the model, which is now coming up. Yes, you do all of these things, but it's got to have a core to it. And I would now put in that core, this is out of our book, the core values of the fact that we are a vocation, that we have a vocation, and that the respect and dignity, respecting the dignity and worth of the other, the gift that is the other. We could put that as Catholic schools in at the heart, and then all of the others still apply. We do all of these things, but it's got to have a good heart and a good soul to it. That's why a collective ethic of responsibility is so important. We're almost there. Helen, I have to tell you a little story, though, because as I get older, I'm often asked, oh, why are you passionate about this stuff? Well, I have 8 reasons to be really passionate. They're my grandchildren. And I love them dearly, and I want to see them get a really good deal in schools. And I'll tell you a little story about one of my grandchildren is Cormac Dwyer, and he lives in Adelaide. And on Good Friday, just recently, a sister took them to the church before they went in for the service, and they did the Stations of the Cross. So she was taking them around, and she's explaining the Stations of the Cross, and then she comes, and she's got a very sad look on her face and says, and now, children, this is where Jesus is dying. And she said, and children, to whom do you turn when you're dying? Cormac, is always forward, and said, oh, great Cormac, who? A lawyer. His dad's a lawyer, of course, so everything revolves around being a lawyer. A couple of more slides that I'll leave. You can take these away. This will be up on the internet, on the site later. But this is some of the advice to building a collective ethic of responsibility or a collective leadership capacity. It's all common sense stuff. We already know it. It's just to have definite strategies to make sure that these things happen. But talent above all. There's a lot of work done around attracting talent, keeping talent. I work for an organization as well. I'm a trustee of the Sisters of St. John of God Healthcare, and we advertise ourselves as an employer of first choice. Now, when you put that up there, you've got to live up to it. And we try to live up to it, and the only way we can do that is to live our mission to the full. And we have invested an enormous amount to make sure that we do that. And I have seen that organization transformed. In 13 years that I've been with it, it is transformed. And the talk around, even at board level meetings and that, we start with reflection for action prayers, which go on for 1 hour. We take it seriously, very seriously. And it has helped transform the relationships at both our level trustees and at board. It's amazing what it does. So much of this we know ourselves already and comes from, so I won't go through each one. And that last one, of course, a huge commitment to it, create a culture where leadership is seen as everybody's ethical responsibility. So dare to do it. Go ahead and do it. There's nothing to be lost, everything to gain. You'll all be winners. And we finished the book, and this was Helen who found this, and I was really intrigued with this. This is the last lines of the book, The Power of Many. Don't establish the boundaries first. Many leaders tend to do that. the squares, triangles, boxes of preconceived possibility, and then pour life into them. That's the system world and the life world that Helen was talking about. Trimming off leftover edges, ending potential. A parting shot at effect size and similar research. It trims off the leftover edges all the time. If it doesn't fit the triangle or the square, and that's because of the analysis tools used, then it mustn't be important. That's why you come out looking second rate, second best as leaders influencing student achievement. Don't believe a word of that side of it. Use the research findings. They're I personally use Vivian Robinson's findings and John Hattie's, but what I argue is you have to reinterpret those findings within a new paradigm or a different paradigm of pedagogy and of leadership. Because I'm always reminded of what Einstein said. He said, you cannot solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them in the first place. I'm arguing you cannot have a revolution in pedagogy or a massive change in pedagogy with research findings from the very pedagogy that we're trying to change. We have to think outside the squares, outside the boxes, and this is a beautiful reminder of that for us all. So thank you very much.